Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am back with another episode of the Whole Brother Mission podcast. I am thrilled to have Dr. Jody Armour, who is the author of Nigga Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. And he's also a professor of law at the University of Southern California. How are you doing today, sir?
Very good, Malik. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great.
Good.
So, there's so many things I want to talk to you about, and I think this book is very timely, but considering what's going on in our current culture. But to bring us up to speed with who you are before jumping into the book, can you tell the audience about your journey to becoming a professor of law at USC? How'd you end up here?
Yeah, Malik, I was first introduced to the majesty of the law as an 8-year-old. When, as an 8-year-old, our front door was kicked in by a phalanx of cops, rolled in on my dad. Next time I saw him, he was prostrate with his hands cuffed behind his back. And the next time I saw him upright was on Family Day at the Ohio State Penitentiary, when you could come down and visit with parents and who are incarcerated and family members, because we know that family separation didn't just happen at the border under Trump. There's been family separation as part of the criminal justice process in America since forever, especially over the last 30, 40, 50 years, when there's been this real spike in mass incarceration that's targeted black men. It's been referred to by people like Michelle Alexander as the new Jim Crow. I call it racialized mass incarceration. And we'll get into that hopefully a little more. But he was looking at 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana. And he was one of those uppity black men who was going to do all 55, by the way. And his only route out was to reach up on the warden's bookshelves and start taking down law books and teaching himself criminal law, criminal procedure, and constitutional law. Then he got a manual royal typewriter and started typing out his writs of habeas corpus and other legal memoranda on his cell floor, until 5 years later, after he'd exhausted his state appeals and moved over to the federal system and gone through the district court, I was standing next to him in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati as he was arguing before an en banc panel of judges, literally for his life. And now I teach his case in my criminal law class. It's called Armour versus Salisbury. And it stands for the proposition. You would have thought it would have been established well before his case. Now his case is one you shepherdize for the proposition that it's a denial of constitutional due process by the state for a prosecutor to lie to a jury, intentionally, deliberately lie to a jury to get a conviction against a defendant, somebody who's being prosecuted. So my dad had to prove that the prosecutor was a liar, a proven liar, a demonstrable liar, and that his lie denied him constitutional due process. He prevailed on that, and that's what kind of, Malik, got me into thinking about the power of words, power of language, because all he had between him and a lifetime behind bars was word, work, language. That's all he had. And he put words together in a certain order and paragraphs in a certain order, and the next thing you knew, his jailhouse door, his prison cell door was being flung open. So that's how I got into thinking about the law seriously. I wound up very quickly in a program called A Better Chance, because when he went away to prison, we went from a middle-class existence to crumbs and roaches and rats. So the only way I got out of that situation was a Great Society program called A Better Chance that takes kids out of inner city areas and puts them in boarding schools where they have a better chance to go on to college and, go from there. So I went from A Better Chance to Harvard for undergrad, Berkeley Law School, went right into teaching pretty much, and have been teaching criminal law, tort law, which is accident law, and Stereotypes, Prejudice, and the Rule of Law, my boutique upper-level seminar offering.
Got it. Well, there's a lot there with that story. I feel like just that history alone, that's a whole interview right there. So maybe we can talk more about that later. But I think that's a really interesting background for you, especially considering what you're focusing on now, and now being able to teach that in your class. That's huge. What's the normal response to that? Because even me, you know, I did look into you, you know, before we spoke, so I knew some of these things. But what's the typical response of your students when you share that?
Well, I think a lot are a little surprised that someone with my kind of background has gotten to the point where I'm teaching law school classroom. Sadly, you know, if you come through very difficult backgrounds, your odds of escape are very slim. And so, you know, you don't tend to see a lot of people teaching law who have come from backgrounds where their dad has been incarcerated at a very young age, and they've been reduced to government cheese and AFDC and scratching out an existence, you know, in any way necessary that you can get by on. So, you know, that part is a little, I think, surprising to some, but that's why, Malik, one of the questions you kind of posed in a little earlier conversation of ours that we are going to get into, so why not now, is the N-word in the title of my book. And why, and it's because of what you're asking me now that I use the N-word in the title of my book. You know, the N-word is raw. My experience with the criminal law is raw. The criminal justice system is raw. I don't see any particular reason for us to, you know, strive for comfortable conversations when we're talking about black bodies in bondage, you know, hundreds of thousands, and more in, cages, who are being tortured in solitary. And, we don't want to really look at their plight because we, as a society, not all of us, but as a society, and many, including many in the black community, we don't care about them because they're criminals. Because they, you know, once we otherize you by calling you a felon or a criminal, and that's why I use the N-word in my title. Once we niggerize you, then we have a very easy time not giving a damn about you. It's a lot easier not to give a damn about somebody who's not worthy of our care and concern because they are niggas or niggers. And where I got that from is Chris Rock's routine to launch his comedic career. Everyone wants to put a mic in front of his mouth now and ask him to opine on racial justice matters as though he's an oracle. But let's remember how he launched his comedic career, by going back and forth in front of a black audience in a routine called Bring the Pain, 1996. And his opening lines were roughly, it's like a civil war going on in black America, and there's two sides. There's black people and there's niggas. And niggas have got to go. I love black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Shit, I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he goes on like that for over half an hour with a black audience laughing, amening, hunting, you know, preaching all the expletives you can think of, encouraging him to draw this line between black criminals and law-abiding black, because his basic definition of a nigga is a morally condemnable black criminal. That's his base, some morally condemnable black or black criminal, because those are the activities that he describes these niggas engaging in. And if you accept that invitation in the punchline of that joke to distinguish between law-abiding good Negroes and morally condemnable bad Negroes or niggas, you are a big part of the problem today. You've always been a big part of the problem. If you're in the black community especially, you've always been a big part of the problem. Now, you know, you're probably ducking low and you know, Chris Rock would not embrace that routine today, would he? It doesn't sound quite so good today to say all these brothers who happen to be locked up are niggas. It sounds pretty tone deaf, in fact. But that's how time is. It catches up with you, right? And so even though those attitudes are still there, people still feel the way he did, they are lower key right now, and you're hearing a lot more people talk about, we care about the incarcerated, we want to make deep cuts in incarceration for our brothers and sisters, etc. Yeah, okay, see if they really mean that. If they're extending that to violent offenders, for example, because most of the folks in prison are there for not low-level nonviolent drug offenses. That's a fantasy. They're in there for violent offenses, the majority. Those are just the numbers, and they're not, disputable. So, yeah, that's why the book has the title, the N word in its title. I'm taking a shot at that mentality, that whole way of looking at the world, that invitation to draw a political distinction between morally upright, good Negroes, law-abiding, and morally condemnable, criminal, bad Negroes, right? That is a pernicious dichotomy, and it's a pernicious distinction that's been fed to a lot of black people, and a lot of middle-class black people, especially, and others, still embrace that politics of respectability way of thinking about the black community and criminality, and it's wrong 6 ways from Sunday, and that's what I'm getting at. One of the things I'm getting at in the title to the book, Malik.
Well, thank you for that explanation. You kind of stole my next couple steps with, the question and the explanation, and I was planning to reference Chris Rock as well because it just makes sense. We know the history. And I know the pushback that he got years ago when he said that, but I'm with you. I think it's important to have a very real dialogue about these things, and be realistic about, whether you want to call it otherization, stigmatization, or niggerization. It's happening. And we see it even with the discussions about victims after they die. I always expect when there's a new hashtag of a black man that's been killed in the hands of the police, I now expect some type of media coverage of his past after he dies to then show, see, he was a nigger after all, essentially, so that it's like, well, you shouldn't worry about this because he was a bad guy. He did this, he did that, and it, So I think that's a very real issue, and it's important to have that conversation.
Brother, you putting your finger right on it. Let me jump in right there because I'm feeling you so much on just that point. What the beautiful thing that I love, one of the things I was really attracted to in the Black Lives Matter movement. Because, I really saw it. Fortunately, my students dragged me into the 21st century. They said, Professor, you got to get on Twitter. So they dragged me into the 21st century about 3 weeks before George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin's killer, was acquitted by a Florida jury for shooting to death unarmed 17-year-old Trayvon who had some Skittles and iced tea with him. Okay? And that acquittal gave birth to the Black Lives Matter hashtag. That's the moment it was born, the hashtag. And then it, of course, the hashtag even blew up more once the Mike Brown case in Ferguson came up later. And then, it seemed that every week you had a hashtag, Walter Scott, hashtag Sandra Bland, hashtag Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Philando Castillo. I mean, you just go on and on, the sickening procession of hashtags. But one of the things that the Black Lives Matter activists were very clear on and very forceful on, and it's changed the whole discussion, was that we're not playing that politics of respectability game. We're not going to say, it's important to us to only put certain kinds of Negroes or black people forward as representative of our racial justice struggle. Back in the 50s and 60s, Thurgood Marshall and others only wanted squeaky clean, reputationally and every other way, Negroes to be the kind of poster people of the civil rights movement so that they would be respected. They were respectable victims. They were respectable victims of injustice, of Jim Crow, of racism. And so, white society, you should, really your heart should go out to us because these are good, respectable Negroes, and look how they're being treated. And Black Lives Matter saw early on that what police were going to do, what different media outlets were going to do, and what the right was going to do was to say that these people who were victims of police brutality, unarmed people who were killed, black folks, that they somehow were bad Negroes. They, really didn't deserve the care and concern we give to good law-abiding people. Look at Walter Scott. He was behind on his child support. Hey, wait a minute. If he wasn't behind, if he wasn't behind on his child support, he wouldn't have been running, and he wouldn't have to get shot 6 times in the back by a police officer. But maybe that was bad what the police officer did, but he was bad too. So don't feel too much sympathy, empathy, care, and concern for him. And the same, as you point out, Malik, they go right down the line, constantly putting the black victims on trial. And what Black Lives Matter said early on is, we're not playing respectability politics with these victims, even if they were engaged in criminal behavior of some kind earlier in their lives. And even on the particular occasion, if they were engaged in in criminal behavior, if they were, for example, as Eric Garner was, selling loose cigarettes on the sidewalk, even if they were doing that, or as George Floyd may have done, passed a counterfeit $20 bill, or any number of those kinds of low-level, offenses that people certainly don't deserve to die about, right? Certainly when it comes to all of that, we don't have morally immaculate blacks. They aren't, the law-abiding Negroes in the sense that, well, technically Eric Gardner was doing something illegal. So was George Floyd. So was Walter Scott in running away from the police. So was this, so was that. We can always point to ways in which the victim wasn't Dudley goddamn do-right, right? But one of the points of Black Lives Matter is you shouldn't have to be Dudley goddamn do-right to get respect as a human being. You should be able to be, make mistakes, be human, have human frailties, and still be treated with dignity and respect, especially by state actors who have guns and bullets, right, and use them on you all the time, a lot of times without any kind of real justification. So, yeah, that is, Malik, kind of where I see the politics of respectability issues figuring here, and why I'm so glad Black Lives Matter early on said, we don't play politics of respectability. We don't give a damn about respectability when we're talking about respect for the basic human decency and dignity and humanity of a person that has committed even some kind of infraction or some other kind of crime, but certainly doesn't deserve execution at the hands of the state.
Absolutely. And you touched on something that kind of stands out to me. So before starting working with the Whole Brother Mission, I worked a lot in university life, not state schools, but more private Christian schools. I was the diversity guy for the white schools. And one of the things I noticed is for that concentric, white evangelicals, many of who are Trump supporters, there's this belief that I understand from their faith system that is the idea of human dignity that supposedly exists for everybody. But it's interesting how that human dignity that they claim is a theological belief doesn't apply with these hashtag black men and women. It doesn't apply when the person isn't squeaky clean or Dudley do right or fitting to what they deem credible or worthy of life. So there's an inconsistency that I've seen personally with that application of human dignity as well. And I would stand with you that that's something that's just a general thing that should be applied to everyone. I have a saved draft in my Twitter right now. I didn't send it, but I was going to today. And I was planning to say, I don't care if every black person, robbed their neighbor. that still doesn't give you the right to kill them. We say that we're innocent until proven guilty, and we have these laws in the justice system, but it's interesting how these core beliefs that are Americana or Christian or whatever the case may be get thrown out for black people who are deemed less than, and I think that goes back much further as well. But in moving forward,
let me stay with you on that one point for a moment, Malik, because I like it. The one having to do with our community of faith, right? I grew up in a Baptist Catholic household. My mom was Catholic. My dad and grandma who raised me were Baptists and had some A&E folk over there as well. And so I'm coming kind of from a Christian perspective, and there's some other faiths and traditions that may have their own stories along these same lines. But for me, I especially have interesting conversations with my Christian brothers and sisters who support the death penalty, for example. And I wrote a play over 10 years ago for Stanley Tukey Williams, who'd just been put to death by the state of California when Arnold Schwarzenegger, refused to grant any kind of stay because he concluded that Stanley Tukey Williams had not achieved personal redemption. That was the standard he used, the legal standard he used in his years in solitary torture in San Quentin. And the call of my question for the evening, for the play, was, should we pour liquor for Tukey? Should we, there were 1,200 students roughly in Bovard Auditorium that I did the play before, should we express sympathetic identification with, and political solidarity with a cold-blooded first-degree killer who co-founded the Crips? Because he really doesn't, when we talked, when he was talking, he really didn't deny that he had engaged in, at other times, not necessarily with those particular victims he was alleged to have killed, but he had engaged in deliberate killing, number one, right? And he was the co-founder of the Crips. So people who really, when they hear that, they don't want to hear anything else. That's a bad Negro. That's a so-called nigger, right? Really would lump him in that category. And so I was talking, and my play was against that argument. I was carrying a brief for the damned on behalf of Tukey Williams and saying that we should feel sympathetic identification with him and be in political solidarity with not only him, but many other black criminals like him, violent black criminals like him, and then beyond that, even other criminals, but the violent black criminals in particular. And I remember a Christian friend of mine who is a law professor at another school as well, said to me at the time, well, I think that Tukey Williams, given what he did deserve the death penalty, did deserve execution. And I said, okay, I got you. Okay, so let me ask you this. What do you think would be the appropriate penal fate for somebody who not only killed, let's say Tukey killed 5, let's say he killed 10. I don't want to quibble, right? Let's say he killed 10 people deliberately, coldly, and co-founded the Crips. Let's say that all that was the case, right? What do you think the appropriate penal fate, we know what you think the appropriate penal fate for him is. What do you think the appropriate penal fate would be for somebody who killed 100 times more people? Thousands of people, literally, men, women, and children, for no other reason than their belief system. No other reason. And she said, oh, of course, that's easy, off with his head. And the death penalty, again, easy, right? I said, well, the person I just described was Paul, who was, before he became Paul, who was he? Saul. What was Saul on the road to Damascus to do? Kill some more innocent Christians. That's what he was on the road to do. So if the penal fate that you say should befall even killers, had been imposed upon Saul before he became Paul, we wouldn't even have a New Testament. You wouldn't even be calling yourself a Christian. He's the one who went around and gathered up John and Luke and everybody else, right? That was Matthew. That he gathered all those cats up and said, now write your recollections. Write them down. Let's get this gospel thing together, right? And so, yeah, we don't deeply examine. That's what my book is about, Malik, that you mentioned early on, that doesn't come out till August 18th, but, it can be pre-ordered. It's available for pre-order now. But the reason I really kind of go at it as hard as I do in that book is we seem so comfortable in our hypocrisy. And I hate to call my fellow, I hate to go here. I hate to call my fellow people of the faith who embrace, the New Testament and its warnings about epistemic humility. It's warnings that you don't know what, about someone's real moral worth. You can't make moral judgments of them too glibly. I mean, look, how much more heavy-handed can you get, Malik? Here, if I were writing a book and I said, okay, here's the symbolism I'm going to use. I'm going to use the Son of God. On one side of him, I'm going to put a killer. And on the other side, I'm going to put another criminal, a thief. I'm going to flank him with bad Negroes, if you will, bad hombres, if you will, right? Criminals, a killer. And make it clear that, how much more clear can I make it symbolically that we need to be showing some kind of mercy and to criminals, including violent criminals. We need to find it in our hearts to recognize their capacity for redemption, for rehabilitation, for restoration, and reconciliation, and not just like we have over the last 30 years, just view things in terms of retribution, retaliation, and revenge.
Sure. So there's several sound bites there. I appreciate that. I think that's something for quite a few listeners to chew on. So before jumping to the next thing, one more thing I want to add or ask you here. Many I see today when we have conversations about the justice system and Black Lives Matter and policing and all these things, unfortunately, many times it just gets reduced to a liberal versus conservative conversation. And that frustrates me because there's so much more to this than just partisan politics. But you just spoke about having a little bit more compassion and how we deal with those who have made mistakes, even violent mistakes in the past. How would you respond? Because I know the political climate. Many would take your words and the words of others like that and label you a radical leftist that wants lawlessness within the country, that wants bad people to be able to run freely and hurt good people. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, for one, again, I hate to say this, Malik, but if they are my Christian friends, brothers and sisters, right? And we have a whole lot of Christian brothers and sisters in the Black community. We're one community. When I go to Black events, more than many other events I go to, public events, I know we're going to have prayer. We're going to have a spiritual moment. That's just, it's very still much a strong cultural norm in the Black community. And so I'm saying to all of those, brothers and sisters, that what you're saying is, you're saying that the morality that I'm proposing is kind of revolutionary. Yeah, that's what makes the New Testament revolutionary. That's why it's revolutionary. I mean, if he was coming down saying something that it was going to be easy to perform, to do, hey, you don't need to keep on going to church every week to get reinforced, because it's hard not to give in to your urge for retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and instead to reach down in your heart for redemption and reconciliation and restoration. We do that on Sunday morning, but then on Monday through Saturday, we go back to retribution, retaliation, and revenge. Then on Sunday, here comes redemption, restoration, and reconciliation again, right? Just take Sunday and spread it out through the whole week. Make every day Sunday when it comes to redemption, reconciliation, rehabilitation, and restoration as your guiding values, when it comes to blame and punishment, wrongdoers and punishment of any kind. Now, your further question, which is always the reductio ad absurdum that they want to go to, which is, well, if you don't lock people up, if you don't have some prison system, if you're a complete abolitionist in that way, prison abolitionist in that way, then you'll have violent criminals running rampant through the street, right? And look, one of the things that the black community wants achingly, very much, is they want murders and rapes and serious crimes like those in their community to stop. They want the people who are perpetrating them to be stopped, because that's the only way they'll stop, is if the perpetrators are stopped, right? It's a 1 + 1 = 2 now. We're not doing anything fancy here, and that means that you have to accept at least some level of incapacitation. I don't know why this person may have this pathological urge to have sex with women without their consent. I may not know why he became the rapist he has become. He may have some very powerful stories that he can tell of his upbringing that are heartbreaking and help us understand what drove him to become that kind of person. But in the meantime, I have to, with as humanely as possible, without torturing him, without subjecting him to cruelty or unnecessary, pain and suffering, I have to remove him from our community so he doesn't rape anybody else. Okay? That's just how it's got to be. And now, and anybody who says, well, no, we can't even incapacitate people who are killing and raping others, I don't know. I'm just not in that camp. There may be some who are. I know there are some who are. I'm not one of those folks. I think that what you hear a lot in the black community is we want crimes here solved. Murders in a lot of these communities are only solved at a 40% rate or less. Rapes are often solved at a 20% rate or less. So, a lot of the residents in our black communities are saying, I want these crimes solved, and you're not solving them because instead of having your scarce resources as a police department going toward solving rapes and murders, you're paying all these police to chase down turnstile jumpers and to go after people who are jaywalking and committing all other kind, going after going after weed, making weed busts. You're wasting all these resources on that kind of law enforcement rather than doing something about this rape kit backlog with all of these rapes going unaddressed because you're just not allocating resources to those kinds of issues. So that's what I would say to them. And you can do all of that and still reduce the prison and jail population a lot. Even when you do deal with violent offenders, a lot of times we're giving a violent offender, because they're violent offender, that means 25 to life. We throw out 25 to life sentences like they're nothing. Life for this, life for that. Even for violent offenders, you're talking about people who, for one thing, age out of criminal prone age ranges. You're, as younger people, you're more crime prone. When you get over 50, they're not really posing much of a risk of crime, right? And even earlier in a lot of these timelines. And 5 or 10 years is a long time. Even in America for, years past, for manslaughter, even just killing, intentional homicide, it was in some jurisdictions unusual to get over 12 or 13 years for that. Now we throw out 25 to life sentences or just life without parole or whatever without without any hesitation. So we got to rethink all of that.
Absolutely. So the book is Nigga Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. My next question is probably going to be too big of a question, but I'm just going to throw it out there and you take it wherever you want to go. Here's the preface. We have seen rallies, protests, and some looting in response to some recent deaths and videos that have come to light in regards to black men and women and the police, and just all around not getting fair justice. Even the case with Ahmaud Arbery, he was not killed by active police officers, but there was a clear mishandling of justice afterward. So we see rallying, we see protesting, we see petitions on social media. There's a lot of discussion happening. I do see it starting to die down at this point a little bit. But what, from your perspective, should the goal be, and how do we get there? Because once again, this current emotional reaction, although valid, will die out. And I'll be honest with you, I think through things like this quite a bit. I talk to friends about it. I talk to people in the field about it. And many of us feel kind of hopeless because, in essence, we have a system that wasn't necessarily built for us. And in many cases, we know that we're taught or told by the majority, just wait, be patient, so on and so forth. But it's pretty urgent when people are dying. But when you look at it and you look at how the odds are stacked against us in this regard, where the justice system is permittedly unjust toward us, is there really anything we can do, or is this just the way it's going to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's very easy to become pessimistic and fatalistic about the lack of change. I wrote a book called Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America in 1997, over 20 years ago. And exactly what I was writing about then is going on today. Ain't nothing changed but what year it is, right? And so you can look at the matters through those lenses and feel very pessimistic and fatalistic on the one hand. On the other, we just don't have that luxury right now. We cannot afford the luxury of, kind of philosophical, nothing's going to change. Because that can easily lead people to, well, if nothing's going to change, well, why bother? Mm-hmm. And once people start saying, why bother, then you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there really is going to be no change because no one's going to bother to make change, right? So I have to look at a moment like this and say that there are untapped possibilities. This is a chance for us to go deeper, to go beneath the Band-Aid cosmetic fixes that the mere reformists and the mere liberals and the neoliberals and the whole, just standard establishment corporate Democratic Party, that whole kind of beholden to corporate interest entity has offered a lot of non-solutions and just as often actually thrown fuel on the fire. Bill Clinton threw fuel on the fire. He got a lot more black people locked up. He got a lot more jails built, a lot more police put on the street. That was Bill Clinton. All right. Mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration has been bipartisan. Biden was an architect of mass incarceration. He was one of the key architects. So you don't just look to a liberal versus a conservative agenda for any kind of meaningful change because they haven't offered any, right? Hopefully this moment is an opportunity for us to see that the real underlying problem isn't one that has a technological fix like body cameras. They didn't fix anything, really, nor any other kind of policy tweak like implicit bias training. The officers on George Floyd's neck had that. De-escalation training, community policing, all that was going on up in Minneapolis and more, and you see where that got us. So it's abundantly clear now that the real issues are not ones that can be addressed with those kinds of superficial interventions. Rather, the real underlying issue is that since this nation's inception, Black lives do not matter. Black Lives Matter has not been something that this nation has practiced or believed in. Starting with chattel slavery, do I have to even start there? The Declaration of Independence, we're getting ready to celebrate it here on July 4th shortly, and, we're going to sing the praises to these people who endorsed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 on July 4th in Philadelphia, and talk and declare that all men are created equal and and should be able to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, while they had slaves waiting for them at home. And people like you and I, Malik, were on auction blocks in public squares being traded. Those are the people whose Declaration of Independence we're going to be celebrating in a few days here on July 4th. But Black lives didn't matter then, did they? They didn't matter after the Civil War, after that cataclysmic race war that killed 600,000 Americans, in order to end bondage to bring black bodies out of bondage. By the way, when people talk about allies, that's what allyship looks like to me. If you're not talking that, when you're talking people, Gettysburg and white folk laying down their lives on a battlefield. I know different people had different motives. There's lots of reasons people fight, right? They go out there to fight. A good number of them went out to fight against this inhuman institution of chattel slavery that everybody could see was utterly inhuman, barbaric. And there a good number of bodies out on those bloody battlefields were there for that reason. I don't want to argue about how many. Someone want to argue about mixed motives, that people here for that reason, this reason, that. A good number of them were there for the right reason, right? And there's still some allies that we can find here today, but those are the kind of allies you need, ones who are willing to lay something on the line to fight for black equality and black freedom, because that's what they were dying for on the fields of Gettysburg. Right, so that's just a quick aside about allyship. But back to kind of the main point is Black lives didn't matter during Jim Crow. While we were in our American form of racial apartheid, and all of the stunning of growth that happened there of the black community by the white power structure, and then. Do Black Lives Matter now? When I walk down the street here, Malik, to Skid Row in L.A., which is the largest homelessness encampment in the country, the fiercest expression of structural violence in America, and you look to the left and right and you see it's 75% black, not 75% people of color, 75% black. So when have Black lives mattered? Hurricane Katrina, black people standing on rooftops with water up to their necks, right? Here, 1 day goes by, 2 days go by, 3 days go by, 4 days go by, water still up to their necks. Sean Penn is rowing up, handing out fresh water because FEMA still couldn't get its act together. 4 days into black people having water up to their necks. That's what's happening in Skid Row. Water's up to their necks, and nobody's giving a damn about it. Compare that reaction to the one of the United States after those planes ran into those buildings in 9/11. And there was a panic of empathy for those victims, and we just got it done. We just got to them and helped them, right? Nobody wanted to hear about bureaucratic impediments or red tape. There was just a panic of empathy, and they were helped. That hasn't been happening with Black lives. Black lives have not mattered until they start to matter, until we figure out a way to get people to act like they matter, Malik, we're not going to deal with the underlying problem. But now at least we see it clearly.
Right. So I know we can't afford to just wait for prosecutors, district attorneys, judges, or police officers' hearts to change. We can't just sit around hoping for the best.
Nope.
So in a practical sense, though,
Yep.
what is one thing you think that we could put our attention toward more? Is it more, black people seeking to be judges or, district attorneys? Is it, more police on the ground? I mean, everybody has different suggestions. What would you say is one thing that maybe is under addressed or unaddressed that we could put our attention toward that may help us to see some progress in this area?
Okay, I'll start with what it is. Now, I'll first give you what it is, and then I'll go back to what it isn't, because you named a lot of things that it isn't that people often say it is. That's all we need to do. It's not. But before we get that, let me give you a direct answer first. One direct answer would be elect new prosecutors. If we're talking about the criminal justice system, the prosecutor's office has almost unlimited discretion in a lot of ways. And they are a large part of the reason that we have racialized mass incarceration today. And so, first and foremost, for example, here in LA, there's getting ready to be an election for the next prosecutor, and it is a black woman named Jackie Lacey. That's back to your point about, now I'm going to be critical of the point about, well, what is one of the solutions to get more black people into office? No, that is not one of the solutions. I would say that first, no. And now let me back up and demonstrate why the no. Getting black people into office who will really promote and protect the interests of black people, yes. But just getting a black face into office, that's like just getting a black face on the Supreme Court. Well, look who you got, Clarence Thomas. He's done as much to damage the interest of black people by his judicial decisions as any other judge on the Supreme Court, right? So just because you have a black face in an office doesn't mean that you have somebody who's going to really promote and protect black interests, the black community's interests first. Even if not first and foremost, which it should be first and foremost, frankly, if you are running as a candidate concerned about racial justice, it's hard for me to imagine you running as someone who's sick and tired of women being oppressed and saying, well, I'm not going to put women's, liberation as something first and foremost on my agenda. I would hope that at least I'd understand if you made it first and foremost. Black politicians have to be held to that kind of standard, or at least if you're not going to make that your first and foremost issue, you're going to give it significant weight. You're going to give it adequate weight, which means, the weight it deserves, and it deserves a hell of a lot of weight in your decision-making process, okay? So if you want to, avoid some other kind of language games and semantics that people may want to play about, should you put the black community's interest first and foremost? But Jackie Lacey is an example of a black woman who's the head prosecutor in LA, which is a position of enormous power. You're elected to the position, and it is the most powerful position in law enforcement, the most powerful. Way more powerful from the standpoint of mass incarceration than the chief of police's role, or any rank, any lieutenant, captain, anybody else in the police department, and the mayor's office too. In terms of, law enforcement, that prosecutor makes the decision about what charges are going to be brought, how many charges, how long you're going to be tried for, what penalty you're going to have to suffer if you decide to go to trial rather than accept whatever plea we cram down your throat. The prosecutor has enormous discretion. And somebody like Jackie Lacey has said things like, when people ask her, why do you prosecute 13 times as many blacks as non-blacks, her answer was, black people make bad decisions. All right. If you have a prosecutor, and you can check that, Google that, don't take my word on it. In her debate that she had with George Gascon and Rachel Rossi, she says that explicitly. I wrote an op-ed about it, so she knows she can't run from that. If you elect somebody with that mentality into that office, what does it matter whether they're black, brown, blue, or purple, right? What does it matter? They have anti-black policies that they're pursuing, and that's all that should matter, And somebody, one of the things that Black Lives Matter has made abundantly clear too, through its activism, is the issue isn't black and white. It's never been, a black versus white issue. It's always been a black versus blue issue, right? You have a lot of cops in blue who are just as brutal and abusive as white cops. Look at Freddie Gray. Three of the 6 cops that were accused of killing Freddie Gray, at least 3 were black rather. A lot of these cases of police brutality involve black officers. So it's never been about black versus white. It's been about blue and the mentality that comes with blue, and the anti-black mentality that tends to come with the blue uniform that seems almost endemic to it. Except, there's some groups like LEAP and some other groups that are law enforcement groups that are resisting some of that. But by and large, that there's a culture there that is, Blue Lives Matter, and damn it, I'm proud of it. And what else is there to say? Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So with all this considered, I thank you for that note. I think that's something that's more tangible for us to pursue. Of course, it's not as easy, but I think it's helpful to give us things to consider and understanding how the power structures work, because I appreciate this new generation that'll make a scene on social media, but you and I both know that the prosecutor doesn't care what's happening on Twitter. And although we do see some officers being fired and so on and so forth, I do think there's a point in the org chart where that stops, where Twitter isn't going to sway. And maybe it can. Maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't think Twitter is going to sway a prosecutor, especially like the one that you mentioned.
And the only way it'll sway prosecutors is by making them feel that their reelection is being jeopardized somehow by all of this buzz that maybe they're getting on Twitter. If that can translate from Twitter to the ballot box, right? And if you can get the outrage that's on Twitter into those ballot boxes so that somebody like Jackie Lacey goes, like they say in the hashtag Jackie Lacey must go, once you start bouncing people like that, then that'll show that Twitter has some real clout, when it comes to the franchise, the vote itself. And wow, that's a huge deal in its own right.
Right. Yeah, and that's good to connect voting to this too, and especially with an election year coming up. It's important to see that we can contribute toward the or be part of the solution by who we vote in, and not just looking at the presidential election, because there are implications at a local level. Like a lot of these police brutality cases, their issues are what's happening locally, not necessarily federally. But we do need to look at our Justice Department as well.
Your point is great. Don't just look at the presidential election. Even if you don't want to vote for, if you can't hold your nose and vote for either one, even if you can't, go in and vote down ballot. Forget, okay, don't do anything there. Vote, do something about that prosecutor, the sheriff, if the sheriff is running for election, the city council members, the mayor, all of those people are making decisions about how the criminal justice system is going to look. And you have enormous, your vote can really matter there, even if you may be more cynical about and pessimistic about what's happening at the national level at the top of the ballot.
Yeah. So in closing, can you just tell us about what to expect in your book? What can we expect to get from reading Nigga Theory? Yeah,
a lot of this conversation we've been having, Malik, is what I wrote the book about. I'm trying to invite us, encourage us, exhort us to come up with a new moral framework, a new moral compass when it comes to thinking about criminals in general and violent criminals in particular. And I'm talking about black criminals right now, and how we in the black community once, wrapped our arms around a politics of respectability that called our black brothers and sisters who were criminals niggas. Bill Cosby did a famous routine on pound cake, his famous pound cake speech, infamous one, where he says, why people complain about that black boy getting shot in the back of the head over the pound cake? Why did he take the pound cake? I've been hungry. I've not had some pound cake. I didn't take it. You know why? Something called upbringing. That you had a lot of us talking like that, right? And that we still do. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is get us to fundamentally, challenge that moral compass, that moral framework, and, to find ways to forge political solidarity, bonds of political solidarity with black criminals in particular. And also, part of this project, Malik, is rap and, hip-hop culture more generally, but rap in particular, because, like I said, my dad got out, was able to get out of prison with language. That's all he had. And I tell my students now there are 4 occupations in America whose bread and butter is word work, language itself. That'd be writers, poets, lawyers, and rappers, right? I think a lot about the power of language that you see in these urban griots, people like Pac, Nas, I'm going back, I'm old school, my Mount Rushmore is Pac, Nas, Hove, and Cube. That's just me. But they're all, N-word virtuosos, number one. They are engaged in politically critical art, some more than others, but all some. Pac a lot, Cube a lot, sure, Nas a lot, Hove from time to time. He'll get in there and mix it up too, and so this book is also about tapping into that art form, into its energy. I talk about Pac. I talk about, various artists who, for that matter, Dave Chappelle. The last poet, Richard Pryor, even Chris Rock. People who've used the N-word is sometimes part of social commentary. And sometimes, and Dave Chappelle certainly does that. So it's in that spirit. And so it's performative. It's a book in which I'm performing, from a particular genre. At the same time, I'm doing a lot of, moral philosophy, legal philosophy, a lot of other kinds of critical, analyses. At the same time I'm doing that, I'm also participating in this art form, this kind of in-laden art form that has roots in NWA, goes through Cube and, like I said, death certificate and all of that, right on up through somebody like Kendrick getting a Pulitzer, getting recognized for the word work as again, someone who uses language in a challenging way. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping folks get out of it, Malik.
That's good. So, in closing, I have a few things. So, I've had some friends that I know, and then who are authors, and others as well who I don't know, whose books are seeing a spike in sales right now because of the current climate. I know white people in droves are buying books on race and the black experience, and I think your book they should add to that list for trying to understand these things better, but also black people as well, because as you mentioned, the Bill Cosby reference and the Chris Rock reference, how we see ourselves, how we look at class, and what types of black people are palatable and which ones aren't, and which ones we should hide, and so on and so forth. Those are things that I think we need to think through as a people as well. and how we might contribute directly or indirectly to the status quo that we're discontent with. In addition to that, you mentioned Chappelle. It's funny, you keep mentioning things that I plan to mention too. So I really think, as I've mentioned to you before, that this will be a very timely book, and I imagine and assume it's going to go very far because of the current moment. But with that in mind, I'm reminded of, I got introduced to Paul Mooney through Dave Chappelle, and I remember one of Paul Mooney's jokes was, I don't want to get too famous or too successful because white people might just come and take me. So I want your book to be successful, but I don't want white people to take you, though.
Hey, listen, you know what? I am dyed in the wool. There's a few things that I'm dyed in the wool about. One of them is being from Akron, Ohio. I'm a Buckeye. Like people after LeBron went down to Miami, nobody who wasn't from Ohio could see him coming back to Akron. But we knew that, Akron has long arms. Ohio has long arms. So I'm dyed in the wool when it comes to that Buckeye stuff, Malik. And, I'm black to the bone. My home is your home, in that respect. And that's because of my dad's experience. If not for my dad's experience and recognizing that, man, you and I, Malik, I enjoy light skin privilege. I know there's some issues within the black community, but when it comes to that most fundamental issue, you and I are standing on the same auction block. And that's how I define blackness, right? Who could have been standing on that auction block, right? And so my recognition of that reality is going to keep me from, from slacking. Don't worry about that, bro. I ain't going to slack on this.
Absolutely. I don't doubt you at all. It's just, Paul made it seem like they'll just put you in the bag and drive off.
Yep.
But it's Professor Jody Armour, professor of law at USC. For those that want to connect with you, what's the best way?
Yes. My Twitter handle, @NiggaTheory. The last film about my work, 22-minute documentary, what used to be called Nigga Theory, but it was changed to Civil Wars and got into a lot more film festivals that way. But my first article is Nigga Theory, the book's Nigga Theory, and the Twitter handle, @NiggaTheory.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for pushing against the grain and forcing us to have necessary conversations about race, language, and justice. I appreciate your time. I am Malik Blade. This has been the Whole Brother Mission podcast.
Thank you.